Tyneham is a small village nestling in the valley below Whitway Hill. However, it is no ordinary village, but one where time has stood still, except for the ravages of time that have taken their toll. For Tyneham was once a populated village, the villagers living their daily lives without thought of what one day was going to happen. The Second World War came, and although Tyneham was not a place likely to be targeted by bombs, the Ministry of Defence targeted it instead. The people of this idyllic valley live simple lives, relatively untouched by the outside world. But Tyneham's fate was sealed by Churchill's War Cabinet when it decided the valley was needed for military training and was evacuated in 1943 to allow Allied troops to exercise in the build-up to the D-Day landings. The villagers and the estate owners, the Bomb family, never returned. The Post Office Row in 1900 with hedging. This photograph, taken in 1910, shows the row with stone walling instead of the hedge. 1907, left to right. Louisa Milson, adopted daughter of Annie Fry. Edith Pitman, daughter of the postmistress. Annie Fry, Tyneham schoolmistress. Jane Pitman, Tyneham's postmistress. Polly Tizard, Jane's sister from Warbarrow. And notice in the background the window showing the general store's inventory before becoming the post office as well. 1911. Harry and Edith Barnes with daughter Phyllis. Mrs. Barnes took over when Mrs. Pitman retired, and the general store became a post office as well. It was hardly big enough, with the parcels waiting to be collected, bags of flour and soda having to be stored on the floor, and all the provisions Mrs. Barnes was required to stock. Business was brisk indeed, and it was questionable if one could get in the shop due to all the clutter. The modern world catches up with Tyneham, with the introduction of the telephone and transportation, as can be seen by the telegraph pole and motor cars. The post office cottage was home to the Driscoll family from 1938 to 1943, and here is nurse Betty Driscoll, aged 19. The row in 1930, with the addition of the telephone kiosk outside the post office. The postman's sidecar, with Rex the dog on guard, and this sidecar was used to deliver the incoming mail from Wareham and took the outgoing mail. In 1940, the bike and sidecar were upgraded to the now familiar red post office van. Joan Driscoll, aged 16, delivered both mail and telegrams throughout the area and knew absolutely everyone. She then trained to be a nurse and was sent to the front line with the 14th Army in the Second World War. Peter and Colin Driscoll in the post office garden. With no pipes running water in Tyneham, the brothers had the daily chore of collecting drinking water from the tap near the church. But on Mondays, with the mail wash to be done, it was a fairly substantial number of buckets to be carried in order to fill the copper water boiler, and still be ready in time to catch the school bus. Mrs. Gwendolen Driscoll, the last postmistress of Tyneham village. Peter and Colin Driscoll looking at the remains of their front room fireplace in 1982. The row of cottages seen here in 1979, just as the cottages started collapsing, and the row seen here in 2011. (1911) Farm labourers Percy Curley, Fred Lucas and Bill Holland. Laying paving slabs outside labourers' cottage are Tom Gold, Harry Sermy, Bert Taylor, Fred Lucas, Jim Curtis and Charlie Meach, with the church and village tap in the background, photograph taken in 1911. Labourers' Cottage in 1929 was the home of Ernest and Evelyn Whitlock from 1933 to 1942. Ronald Whitlock, born in Tyneham 1935. Eileen Whitlock outside Labourers' Cottage in 1937. Ernest sitting behind the wheel of a Fordson, the first tractor in Tyneham Farm, 1942. Ronald Whitlock, whose father worked for Walter Case Smith at Tyneham Farm, and at the time there were lots of troops billeted in Tyneham, and his father acted as the unofficial camp barber. The troops used to sit in front of the cottage on the wall while he cut their hair. This fountain, bearing the date 1853, was a common drinking water themed inscription from the Bible. Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. I wonder if Peter and Colin Driscoll would agree with that after collecting water for the mail wash every Monday morning from this very tap. As usual, HSE intervenes without respect for our historical heritage with the sign to the left of the tap that reads, "Do not drink." So much for everlasting life. St. Mary's is a small church built of limestone rubble, dating from the 13th century. The south transept was built in the mid-19th century by the Reverend William Bond. The church contains memorials of the Bond family of Tyneham House. After the military took over the church, it was neglected and some fittings were moved. The bells and organ were moved to Steeple Church and on the Jacobean pulpit to Lowworth Camp. The church is now maintained by the military and has become the site of an exhibition giving information on the history of the Tyneham Valley. Tyneham Church in 1920. Tyneham Church boarded up in 1970. A sentimental journey in 1979. The Wellman sisters attend the first service held in Tyneham Church for 36 years. The picture shows 3 sisters of the Wellman family who lived and grew up in Tyneham and are seen leaving the church. They are, left to right, Mrs. Rose Dandow, Mrs. Joy Bugler and Mrs. Ivy Simpson. Tyneham Church from the east. This picture was taken in October 2012. In 1994 the old school was reopened, restored to how it looked in the 1920s. Work followed on the church and many of the cottages with a series of displays explaining village life under what was, to all intents and purposes, the last vestiges of feudal England. As you enter the school, there is Nature's Table on display. This entrance leads into the main hall, which is a single classroom school. In here one can see the children's desks with their work still on the top of the desks as if they had just gone outside for a playtime break. A single coal and wood fire works hard to keep the classroom warm in the winter months, complete with a piano and a blackboard. Panning round, one can see another blackboard, the teachers' desks and 2 bookcases, either side of the classroom entrance, and the walls support educational posters. Arthur Grant at the opening of the schoolroom exhibition in 1994. In his childhood, Arthur found a Kodak camera, a collapsible one, with bellows, on the beach at Woolborough. He got quite interested in photography. His father let him use the camera, and it was better than their old box Brownie. After serving in the Merchant Navy and with Qantas Airways, Arthur settled in Wareham and became a freelance photographer for the local papers. The rectory, a plain and unassuming building with a cheerful air of modest comfort, could accommodate a typical Victorian family. In 1891, the budget of Canon Christopher Wordsworth would not run to a carriage or trap, so Mrs. Wordsworth would regularly walk a dozen or so miles to Wareham for household shopping, and back, as did all the housewives of Tyneham, returning with perambulators heaped with shopping along with their babies. We hear so much about the standard of living before the wars, but despite of it, the country people must have been a good deal harder and stronger than their grandchildren. The rectory roof was incorrectly constructed, which gave rise to perpetual problems of rain pouring into the house during rainstorms, and became a permanent nightmare. This may have contributed to its ruined state, besides being neglected over time, as reported by Joan Sharp, 94 years of age, while visiting her old home in 1994. The home of the rectory employees, and like the rectory, they have given themselves up to time and neglect. Laundry Cottage, owned by the Tyneham estate, and this was the only dwelling with running water, no doubt for supplying a laundry service to the village. As with other buildings in Tyneham, the ravages of time and neglect have taken their toll, and the exterior of the cottages are nearly overgrown. The interior is no better off, with the roof missing, and the first floor ceiling gone. It is just a shell of its former self. But the wash-by-hand laundry wash basins are still in evidence. The laundry cottage in 1943, also known as Taylor's Cottages. The laundry arrived every Monday morning in 2 huge wicker hampers delivered by Charlie Neach, 1884 to 1971, with his horse and cart. Home to the Taylor family in 1902 to 1943, Emily Taylor, 1865 to 1917. She was only 52 when she died in 1917, and was thought to be simply worn out with work, worry and grief for her lost children, William, Arthur and Bert, who died during the First World War. It was said that Emily's father, William Taylor, 1865 to 1952, was a solitary man. There was nothing he liked better than to be out in the woods rather than having to endure the endless banter and drabblings of his fellow man. Helen in the centre and Bessie to the right, outside Laundry Cottages. Theirs was the pleasantest position in the village, warm and sheltered, close to the church and street, but not too crowded by the neighbours. The 90th birthday party of Granny Rose, 1940. Helen Taylor, 1901 to 1998, who left school at 14 and went to work at Tyneham House as a seamstress, mending sheets, turning them side to middle, darning, making and mending curtains and covers. Helen spent her final years in a Swanage nursing home. Her memories are recorded in Tyneham, a tribute to Dorset's lost village by Andrew Norman. With 6 breadwinners in the Taylor family, they were soon able to afford a pony and trap. Mrs. Alice Wellman in 1927. Alice was the daughter of Shepherd Lucas, who lived in the Post Office Row with his wife Jane and their 10 children. Harry and Marjorie Grant, 1931. In the garden of Gwyle Cottages. Harry and Marjorie's parents moved to Tyneham when Harry got the job as the estate woodsman for the Bond family. They had John Gould's house and he moved to Gardener's Cottage as he had been promoted to head gardener at Tyneham House. Cyril Griffiths, 1943, adopted son of Harry and Marjorie Grant. Cyril and Colin Driscoll played a lot, mostly in the duck pond, where the Gwyle re-emerges from under the road. In 1939, after the war started, they made battleships out of cuts of wood, using old nails as a 16-inch gun. Arthur Grant, aged 7, with his new bike. An enterprising boy was young Arthur. He discovered a good way of making extra pocket money was to volunteer to open and close gates for the incoming number of motorists who began to come from far afield to visit Warborough Bay. There were 4 gates, and a penny or 2 was thrown from the cars as a reward, and a good day a boy might take home as much as 3 or 4 shillings. Peter and James Wellman, 1994. Peter Wellman, aged 69 on the left, and his brother James, aged 74, come face to face with their past. George Richards, at 83 years of age, with his widowed sister, Mrs. Mangtalo, in 1910. George, who died in 1914, was the last member of his family to live in the village. There had been Richards in Tyneham for 200 years. The double cottages in 1945, after the time of the villagers being dispossessed. Home of the Everett family, 1920 to 1943, and home of the Davis family, 1926 to 1935. Jim Curtis, head gardener, 1907 to 1925. Mrs. Annie Curtis, wife of Jim Curtis, head gardener, outside Gardener's Cottage in 1907. Tom Gold, gardener at Tyneham House for over 40 years. Tyneham Farm, home to Kate and Walter K. Smith, 1902 to 1940. Walter K. Smith in his Alston Tourer. Walter K. Smith. The last tenant of Tyneham Farm was S.C. Churchill. Now, he wasn't a very popular person. He was a newcomer for one thing, but he also brought the first tractors to the valley. Previously, everything had been done by horse, so he laid off farm workers, and of course he got the compensation when the village was evacuated. And seen here is Cyril Barnes on one of the offending land working vehicles. The farmhouse, lost to the passages and ravages of time and neglect, as are the other buildings of Tyneham village. Gardener's Cottage was home to the Gould family from 1925 to 1943, and in that year of 1943, Tom and Virtue Gould, their son John, and his wife Muriel, and all other Tyneham residents were evacuated from their homes. They expected to return. From that moment on, Tyneham was fated to military ecology. The War Office initially commandeered the village and the surrounding area for the duration of the war to be used for the training of troops to defeat the German army. And some 250 odd residents were displaced with just a month's notice. One of the last to leave pinned what, with hindsight, is a heartbreakingly sad note on the door of St. Mary's, the village church, before going. The note read, "Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us lived for generations to help win the war to keep men free. We shall return one day and thank you for treating the village kindly." In the meantime, John Gould was serving with his regiment in India when Tyneham was evacuated. John was typical of the working man sent to war, quietly determined and utterly convinced of his moral right to return to his home. He would come to protest proudly, wearing his trade union and veteran badges. In 1948, however, having hung on to the area long after the German Reich had been defeated, the War Office issued a compulsory purchase order for the village and surrounding land. Since then, it has been part of the Loworth Ranges. The villagers, not owning their homes, were compensated only to the value of the produce of their gardens, and many of them died without seeing their village again. Life's experiences and the loss of his Tyneham home must have contributed to him being the antithesis of landed gentry. By 1947, the government had made it clear that they would not release land requisitioned by the War Office in 1943 because areas for practical training had to be provided. The protest began and continued for the next 20 years. In 1968, dwindling protests were brought to life by protesters advocating a more positive action. John Gould's wish to return to Gardener's Cottage was the symbol of hope and resistance for the 1943 committee. John Gould, seen here planting a rosebush on his grandparents' grave. To gain access, campaigners had to cut through barbed wire surrounding Tyneham Church. These stunts of protests attracted a lot of media attention, and Tyneham's story provoked a national outcry. Published in 1973, the Nugent Report recommended the release of all 7,200 acres of Army land at Loworth. Campaigners were jubilant, but with the area's economy likely to suffer, many locals were furious, and a Keep the Army in Purbeck community was formed. On the 19th of December 1974, John Gould presented a wreath made of ivy picked from the ruins of Gardener's Cottage to Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, at No. 10 Downing Street. The wreath was inscribed, "We remind those in authority of a broken pledge." With him are left to right fellow campaigners, Mavis Caver, Philip Watkins, MP, and Lord Fenner, Brockway. John Gould's visit to No. 10 was to be the last public gesture of a dwindling campaign. In September 1974, the government white paper rejected the Nugent Report. The army would stay. Major General Mark Bond, whose family had owned the village and lived there for 300 years, would not return to his ancestral home at Tyneham, or the villagers to their cottages. The land would not be given to the National Trust or become a Purbeck National Park. Those battles had been lost. The last paragraph in John Gould's petition to Prime Minister Harold Wilson read as follows: "If you reject this plea, I must make a second request, that when my time comes, I will be interred in Tyneham churchyard. It is there, and in memory of my old friends, my grandparents, and Uncle Tom, who were allowed to live their lives in Tyneham. I would like this wreath to go, but most of all, I want to go home." In 2010, his wish was finally granted, although be it he returned to Tyneham to be buried in the local graveyard in St Mary's Church. Tyneham and the surrounding area is retained as part of Lowworth Ranges. For decades it remains largely unseen, gradually returning to nature until the mid-1970s, when the Ministry of Defence permitted greater public access on weekends and holidays. Now the little village lies in ruins, except for the church and the old schoolhouse that has been preserved, as it was left all those years ago. The names of the pupils are still there, with their coat pegs and their work still on the old school desks. Much has been written in which this place is cast as somehow lost, a ghost village. It is neither lost nor dead, but it has evolved in unfamiliar ways and remains as one of the most beautiful places in our countryside. Tyneham gave its heart for its country in 1943, but with sympathetic management, its soul will survive for generations to come.